My name's Keith West. We'll be going through the concept of cyber warfare, a little about cybersecurity and some of the political implications that go along with that. A few things just to put out there to begin with. I am not a subject matter expert. I want to make that clear. My job is to know enough to be able to explain this to you as effectively as possible. My expertise is taking complicated topics and making them accessible to a general audience, and that's my goal today. So, in particular, there may be instances where you'll have a question and I'll just flat out tell you I don't know and try to point you to where you can find the answers. My big promise is I'll be honest with you. That doesn't mean I know everything. The thing that goes along with that, though, is especially when we're dealing with something that is sort of tech-oriented, different people have different levels of background. And so if I'm using terminology that is something you are not familiar with, please raise your hand and let me know, because I want to make sure we're all on the same page. And there may be times where I'm glossing over something that I really should explain better. So let me know if we run into any of that stuff. Sound good? If you've got questions, throw your hands up. I may occasionally say hang on to that till we get done with this point, because we're actually going to answer that question, but I'm going to try to get to those. I've also got a set of time at the end, a few discussion questions that especially dive into the political implications and what we believe our government should do in this front and what should and should not be the rules that I want to get your input on. So let's kick things off at the beginning. I want to give you an idea of the basic things that we're going to cover today. We'll talk first about what cyber weapons are, what they can do, what cyber warfare looks like, what the capacities actually are compared to what the movies tell you, and what reality actually is. We'll talk about the costs and benefits of utilizing cyber operations, because there are both sides of that. And then we'll have some discussion on what we think government policy should be. Sound good? Awesome. Also, I kind of talk a little fast occasionally, so if I'm going too fast, just slow down, and I will. Okay? Yeah. Great. So, first off, what the heck is cyber warfare? We hear about the concept a lot, but we don't really define it all that much. Here's the real bare basics of it. Cyber warfare, this is sort of the colloquial definition, and then I'll kind of give you the official one. When you're engaging in cyber warfare, you are attempting to get one computer to do something that it doesn't want to do, or that its owner doesn't want to do, and you're using another computer to make that happen. So if I sit here on my laptop and I arrange for the library computer to say that all copies of X-Men comic books are checked out, and the library computer didn't want to do that, I'm engaging in a cyber attack against the library computer to make that happen. Make sense? From a technical perspective, this is the definition that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute uses. It's very similar to the definition used by US Cyber Command and most people around the world who look at this topic. This is the definition of what are called offensive cyber operations, which is generally what we think about when we talk about cyber warfare. So they're operations that attempt to manipulate, deny, disrupt, degrade, or destroy targeted computers, information systems, or networks. Here's what that means. There are going to be a few things actually that do not fall within this that we sometimes think about when we talk about cyber warfare. I'll highlight those in a sec. But this is very similar to the colloquial definition above. When you're trying to mess with another computer, use one computer to mess with another, either to cause it to do something it doesn't want to do, to erase or destroy some of the data or some of the physical components of the computer. That's all cyber warfare type stuff. Same if you're trying to attack a network of things. So I may not be going after a particular computer. I might be going after all the computers that connect to one another and try to exchange information. Like if I go after the computers in a phone company and try to disrupt all the communications that they would have there, that could be a cyber attack as well if I'm using a computer to do it. If I'm going up there and taking an axe to the computers, that is not a cyber attack. You with me? I'm going after a computer, but I'm not using a computer to do it. If I used one computer to hit another computer physically, maybe that's a cyber attack. This definition is unclear, but you get the idea. So this interpretation, this definition of offensive cyber operations, there are a few things that don't fit inside that. And I want to identify these. We'll get to them at the end if people have questions about these specifically, but given the time, I wanted to focus us in on the warfare aspect. First, cyber espionage is generally seen as distinct from cyber warfare. Cyber warfare, you're trying to damage or delete or destroy or manipulate a system. Cyber espionage, I'm getting into your system and reading your emails. Or I'm seeing what your programs look like, or I'm reading the stuff that's on your computer that you don't want me to read. I'm not making the computer do a thing, I'm just getting information from it that you might not want me to have. Difference make sense? So when someone hacks into somebody's emails and reads those emails, that's cyber espionage generally. If they then release those emails to the public, that gets in kind of a fuzzy area. It's probably still cyber espionage, not cyber warfare, because they're not damaging or messing with the stuff on the computer. If they delete all of my emails then we're in cyber warfare territory because they've done something to destroy data that's on my computer. But just reading it, that's espionage. Cool? Second thing, propaganda, disinformation. This is one of the areas that we'll probably hear about the most in cyber warfare, the 2016 interference by Russia in US elections. That arguably doesn't actually fall into the cyber warfare category. Some people will disagree about this. It's kind of a gray area, but if you're trying to put out propaganda or disinformation, even if you're using electronic or digital media to do that, even if you're using computers to put that propaganda out, and even if you're lying about where that info is coming from, that doesn't necessarily make it cyber warfare. It's the same sort of propaganda that we would do when we drop leaflets on someplace in war. We're just doing it with a computer instead of doing it by hand or by having a person stand up and say a thing. You know how we'd put, like, back in the Cold War, right? We did all kinds of propaganda stuff to the Soviets and vice versa, right? They try to get us and our population to believe certain things and vice versa. So this just says that doing that via social media and the internet and whatnot isn't necessarily cyber warfare. We may need some cyber capabilities to defend against that and to interfere with that, but it's not trying to damage or destroy stuff that we have on a computer level. It's just doing propaganda and disinformation, which is still totally bad and still totally something that we can complain about, but it's not the same category of thing. Does that difference make sense? Like I said, this is something we'll get to toward the end. Welcome, grab a seat. So, any questions on any of these distinctions? Is there any terminology I've used so far that hasn't clicked? Because this is absolutely the time to ask. Sweet. So let's talk about what cyber weapons actually are. Unfortunately, they are actually far less cool than what you usually see. Come on in. They are not like fancy things that glow and go whom, whum, whum, whum. They are, in fact, generally speaking, something we call malware. If any of you have like antivirus programs on your computer, right? They are trying to detect and prevent your computer from getting malware on it. Malware is a piece of computer code that gets onto a computer and tries to make that computer do something you don't want it to do. So any of y'all gotten emails where it's from somebody you know, but the text is really weird and it's like, click on this link to help me with this study I'm doing. You're like, this person doesn't do studies on anything. I don't know what this is. Anyone encountered this? Yeah, similar kinds of things. What's happening in almost all of those cases is that person, a piece of malware has gotten onto their computer. And what that, in most cases it's a virus. We're not going to go into the differences between these types unless people are super curious, but something has gotten on their computer and it's gotten into their email. And what it's done is it's taken over a part of their email, and in the background, they probably don't even know this is happening. In the background, their email is now sending out an email to everybody on their contact list. And in that email, it has a link or an attachment that you could download. And if you click on the link or download the attachment, it will then put that virus or that malware on your computer too, and then we'll send it out to everyone on your contacts list, and that's how it spreads. With me on the idea there? And then ideally, these things can then be used to do other stuff to your computer, either to spread spam and just advertising to people, or it could be used to let people track what you are doing on your computer or log what keys you are typing, which can help them get your passwords, all kinds of stuff like that. So that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of malware. That's the most basic version. There are other versions that we'll get into as well when we get into how all this stuff works and what you can do with it. But a cyber weapon is a piece of computer code that you have to get onto an enemy computer, which will then make it do stuff. That definition make sense? Cool. So here's the next bit, and this is essential and super critical. Most cyber weapons are dependent on what are called unrepaired or unpatched exploits. Here's what I mean. So you know how every once in a while, actually my computer right over here is doing this right now. Windows decides, we're going to update your computer randomly without asking you about it. I hope you don't have to do anything for the next 2 hours. Bye. And if you do, you have to borrow a laptop from the library who was generous enough to let you use it. But when it's doing that, anyone know what it's actually doing? Like, what's my computer doing right now when the Windows thing says, we're making updates? What kind of changes? What's that? By and large, yeah, they're patching things. Windows has found out there are some problems, or Microsoft rather, has found out there are some problems with Windows. There are always problems with anything as complicated as an operating system, the stuff that runs your computer. And they found out there are some problems in here, ways that people might be able to get in or mess with it. So they figured out a way to close all those back doors, make it so people can't get in that way. But they have to get that information out to everybody. And the way they do that is by having your computer check in every once in a while and see, is there new stuff that I need to download that will fix all those vulnerabilities? And then as they find out about more vulnerabilities, they have your computer do it again, 2, 6, 8, 12 weeks later. Make sense? So while this is super annoying to me, it is actually super important as well, especially if I work for the Defense Department, which I don't, or I'm someone who's super important and I'm a spy, which I'm not, though if I were, I probably wouldn't tell you. If any of those things are the case, come on in, sir, you're welcome. Join us. If any of those are the case, it's even more important that that kind of patching happens. So what happens with a cyber weapon, though, generally speaking, the NSA is the one who developed it, the National Security Administration. You may have heard about them. They're the ones who are reading your emails without permission and probably violating the law in a bunch of cases and going, whatever. Edward Snowden released a bunch of information about them, if you heard about that a while back. There are a couple other leaks that have come from there. But the NSA, their job, by and large, is to do a lot of cyber espionage. So they try to figure out what's going on in other people's computers all over the world. They're not supposed to do that to people inside the US, but part of what they also do is, part of how they get into computers then is they've got super smart computer people who will look at programs that are on lots of computers. Windows is on a lot of different computers, right? Lots of people use it. Accounting software, Microsoft Word, or any other thing. They pick a program that lots of people use, and they go through all the code for that program, which is tons and tons of information. It takes forever to do. And they start looking for any places where there are problems, or any way that they see that they might be able to get into that program when they shouldn't be able to. With me? And this is the key. Once they find one of those, they do one of two things. Either they call up the company who made the program and say, here's a problem that we found, you should probably patch that and make sure people can't get in there. That's what happens most of the time. But sometimes they go, ooh, this is a really good one. We can do a ton of damage with this. We're not going to tell them to fix it. And this is what's super critical about cyber weapons. They are those exploits, those chinks in the armor that you can exploit in a program, and the people who discover them have to decide to not get them fixed. Because remember, if they tell the company to fix it, they not only fix them in the US, but they'll fix them everywhere, all over the planet, which means they then cannot use that to get into anybody's system. So they find an exploit, they find a chink in the armor, and then they make sure it doesn't get fixed, so then when they want to later on, they can get in. Make sense? The cyber weapon is then the piece of code that they design that will look for that opening, get in through that opening, and then do its thing. Cool? But if that opening closes, that cyber weapon is useless. Which gets us to this. Most cyber weapons only work once, at least without reworking them a fair amount. Because as soon as you do that thing, like I designed my little malware thing, I found a chink in the armor of Windows, for example. There's one called Eternal Blue, which is hackers come up with weird and funky names for things. You'll hear a bunch of them here. But Eternal Blue was the name for a hole that people found in the Windows system. Actually, the NSA found it. And so I've got that hole. I design a program that'll get in through that and then do whatever I want it to do. As soon as I send that out and have it attack, I don't know, Iran or ISIS or whoever I want it to attack, those people will then, after the attack is done or while it's going on, they'll try to figure out what's happening to their computer. Like, why is my computer glitching? Why is stuff coming off of it? And they start going through and they go, wait, this piece of code isn't supposed to be here. Where does it say it came in through? It came in through here? Wow, we should probably fix that. And then they do. And then that piece of code can't get in that same way in the future. So there's a lot of hesitancy within the cyber weapons and the cyber warfare community to actually deploy the weapons they have, because once they use it, it's done. Now they may be able to find weird ways to modify it to let it get around stuff so they can get like a second or third use out of it after spending a bunch of work to modify it, but it's rare that they can use the same weapon in the same form against the same people more than once. Cool? Next, and this is the other thing that's really interesting, most cyber attacks look like glitches at first. It's really tough to tell whether what you're encountering is an attack or just your computer being super annoying like it is all the time, right? There's an operation we'll talk about in a little bit that the US launched against ISIS called Glowing Symphony. Like I said, they have fun names for things. Operation Glowing Symphony, basically what it did is it targeted a bunch of different ISIS people that we'd found their accounts, we figured out what media they were working through. We may not know physically where they're located, but we know what online stuff that they're using. It got into that, got into their computers, and basically created every problem you can ever encounter. So when you go to sign in and it's like, your password is incorrect, please change your password. Anyone else encountered this? Yeah. You change your password, and then you put in the new one and it goes, your password is incorrect, please change your password. 5 minutes later, your password is incorrect, please change your password. And about 50 times of doing that, you get really frustrated. Maybe you destroy the computer for them in frustration, but at the very least, it makes it a lot harder for you to do whatever you're doing. If you're putting out propaganda online, if you are trying to recruit terrorists online, if you are trying to coordinate with people who are supposed to conduct a bombing somewhere, and every 5 minutes you have to reset your password, it makes it really hard to do that. Right? And so these kinds of cyber attacks, initially I don't know if maybe I just typed it wrong and I keep typing it wrong and that's the problem, or if the reason my emails keep getting sent back is maybe there's some problem with how I connected my system to the internet. Maybe the internet provider is messing up. You don't know what's causing the problem at first. And a lot of cyber attacks are designed to be fairly subtle so that it takes a while for people to actually figure out they're under attack and then figure out how to fix it. And then, hopefully for them at least, figure out who did it in the first place. So a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them can look like glitches at first, which makes it really hard to know that you are under attack. Cyber attacks and cyber weapons are deniable. This is one of the other really important things because it's very rare for a country to come out and admit, yep, we totally did that. We are the ones who attacked you that way. Enjoy. Occasionally we'll do that just to sort of give the finger to whoever it is that we've done it to because we're feeling like jerks that day. Or we want to make a statement. But generally speaking, it's possible for whoever orchestrates a cyber attack to claim they had nothing to do with it. And we can kind of figure out who it is, but it's really difficult to do, and it's difficult to be certain about that. We can be about 90% sure, and we'll talk about a number of different cyber attacks that have happened here. And for most of them, come on in, we're 90-ish% sure we know who did it, but it's hard to be 100%. So that also makes it really hard for people to retaliate for them, because you're not sure you're hitting back at the right person. And that really encourages people, especially people who might be vulnerable to counterattack, to go ahead and use these. That's why, for example, North Korea does a lot of cyber attacks because they would be afraid to do a conventional attack because someone might just come in and stomp them. But here, it's a lot harder to know it's them, and it's a lot harder to go after them. Same for Iran and doing these and some other places. The other thing here is that cyber attacks tend to be what we call asymmetric. So asymmetric warfare is where, so symmetry, right? Same thing, like if you're looking at a mirror image of something. Asymmetric is where the images don't match up. You don't have the same thing on both sides. So asymmetric warfare is usually where you have soldiers after civilians, or civilians after soldiers, or a very massive army on one side and just a small group of guerrilla fighters on the other. The point is, the groups on both sides are not largely equal. They're not the same kind of thing. But the soldiers versus civilians is a great example. We generally say that's a bad thing. You shouldn't do that, right? Killing civilians bad. But think Vietnam, right, where the Viet Cong would just melt into the local population, and you didn't know who was the enemy and who was a civilian, versus the US military that were all, for the most part, wearing uniforms, and you did know. That was asymmetric warfare. One side could deny who it was, and we didn't know who the enemy was. The other side, it was very obvious who the enemy was, and that was part of the point. Cyber weapons are asymmetric. Not only do they allow a small force to attack a large force, but they almost always target, that's an overstatement. They often target civilian targets rather than government targets. Like, they'll try to break into the Pentagon and mess with stuff there, and they're actually painfully successful with a lot of that, which we'll get to in a bit. Our cyber defense is terrible right now. But one of the things that people will often do here is you might go after a power grid and try to shut that down. That's not a government resource. Our power grids are privately owned, right? If you go after Sony Pictures, which North Korea did, right, after there was a movie, from all accounts a pretty crappy movie, that they put out that North Korea was really pissed about, they went after them. If you try to mess with an oil company, that's privately owned. So again, you're potentially using government resources to attack a civilian-owned target, which is a different kind of thing than we're often used to. So, I think there was one other thing in here. Yep. Most cyber weapons and cyber attacks are what are considered short of war. So they do less damage than would be done if you dropped a bomb on something. That's a very rough way to look at it, but that's basically the idea. What is done as a result of the cyber attack does less damage than dropping a bomb would do. And often cyber attacks don't generally have human casualties. Sometimes, yes, but not very often. So that means that they are very rarely something that a country is willing to go to war against, unless it's a super big deal. And so partly because that's true, it leads to a lot of people engaging in cyber warfare when they wouldn't be willing to engage in what we call kinetic warfare, or physical warfare. And that means there's a cyber warfare going on just under the threshold of war all the time right now. And that creates its own problems, which we'll get to in a bit. So, Any questions on what cyber weapons are and basic ideas of what their characteristics are? We'll talk about the specific things they can do in just a second. But basic ideas here, we're good? Cool. So let's talk about what they can actually do. There are three large categories of the kinds of things cyber weapons can do. There's denial of service, which we'll go to begin with. There is destruction of data, which we'll go to second. And finally, there is physical destruction or physical damage, which we'll get to in the end. So first off, denial of service. There's something called a DDoS or DDoS attack, distributed denial of service attack. Let me rewind for a second, talk a little about how the internet works. So, anybody got, we'll use this. All right, so imagine this is a pipe, or I'd cut an opening here, right? And I am trying to get straws, put as many straws through this pipe as I can. There's probably a point where I can't get any more straws in there, right? Or putting marbles through, whatever. Think of this as the website. For a website, and every straw I'm putting in is a person who's trying to connect to that website and get information from it. There's a point where there are too many straws and the website can't give you any info and it doesn't load. You get that 404 not found, or website can't be loaded at this time thing. Most companies try to make their website, the pipe, big enough that they can accommodate all the traffic that they expect to have, because it costs money to make it bigger and bigger. They try to get it as large as they think they need to, maybe a little bit more. And for the most part, that works out, unless for some reason lots of people all want to access your website at the same time, in which case it overloads and people can't get there. A denial of service attack, we'll get to the distributed part in a second. A denial of service attack is where you get your computer to go over to the website and say, hey, 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 hi, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. Your computer does what's called pinging a server. It just sends a little packet out there to say, I am here, acknowledge that I exist. And the server says, yes, I acknowledge you exist, and then they're done. That's usually the first step in connecting to a website. You do that, and then data starts going back and forth so the website shows up on your computer. A distributed denial of service attack, or a DDoS attack, it sends a ping, and that's all it does. But it does that hundreds or thousands of times every second. And every time it does that, that's another straw going into the tube. And eventually, there are so many straws that are pings, that are useless ones, that legitimate attempts to access the website can't get in anymore because the entire entrance is blocked. You with me on the broad concept there? You simply overload it with too many useless requests that prevents it from doing everything. So trying to have one computer do that is tough, because most websites are big enough that the pipe is large enough that one computer can't send enough pings through to overload it. They can deal with that. So this is where you get the distributed part. This is where you get a bunch of computers to all do this at the same time. And then that means that, like, if I do this to US Bank's website, that means anyone who wants to transfer money from US Bank or access their account from US Bank can't do that while the website is overloaded. And if you do that to a bunch of banks, that can have huge impacts for someone's economy. Same if I do that to a city or police or fire website where people might report things or get information that they need. So the distributed part, the way that I get a bunch of people to help me out with this, the way that I get a bunch of different computers to ping the server, is technical, because I could just go to a bunch of individual people and say, hey, actually I need a volunteer. Volunteer, somebody. Wow, I'm that scary. Volunteer, thank you. What's your name, sir? Mark, are you willing to help me out? We're going to go try to take a website offline illegally. It's not going to get us anything useful, but if we get caught, we might go to jail. You going to help me out with that? Yeah, good point. And this is usually how people attempting to get thank you, Mark. People attempting to get a bunch of other computers to ping a server would go, right? And you'd be like, help me out. And people are like, why the heck should I do that? I'm getting nothing out of it. So what happens instead is I get their help, I just don't ask them first. And that's what's called a botnet. A botnet is where the term bot is sort of short for something that does something a human would do, but is not actually a person. It's a computer program, short for robot. But so a bot, if you hear about bots on Twitter or on Facebook, it is an automated account that doesn't actually have a person typing things in. It's just automatically putting stuff up there without a person on the other end. It's been programmed to do that. A botnet is where you get a network of a bunch of different bots. And the way this will usually happen is via a cyber weapon. So I get a bunch of different computers or devices out there, and I, just like the email that we talked about, right? I get a virus or malware of some kind in all those computers. And what it tells them to do is at a certain time, in the background, without putting anything up on the screen, if it's connected to the internet, it's just going to start pinging this one website that I've told it to go to over and over and over. And if that happens to your computer may run a little slow during that time, but otherwise you won't really know it's happening. So the idea is if people want to do a DDoS attack, they will spread out their cyber weapon, their malware, to a bunch of different computers a little while in advance, so it has some time to keep spreading. And then at the right time, it all triggers, and 10,000 computers all ping this website 100 or 1,000 times a second. And the website overloads and crashes. And then until the IT people who work for that company or at that website can either figure out a way to make the pipe a lot bigger or can figure out a way to filter out all of the pings that aren't legitimate ones, the website's going to stay offline. It's going to be too crowded for anybody else to get into it. Make sense? That's how DDoS attacks happen. That's how a botnet is largely created. Then theoretically, your antivirus software would be able to find that malware and get rid of it. This is part of why hackers or state groups like the NSA or whoever, that's why they have to keep making new ones so they can stay ahead of your virus checker, basically. And so your antivirus system won't notice or recognize what it is. Yeah?
One reads relatively little in the papers these days about denial of service. I assume that's because all the big sites, Bank of America, et cetera, have defenses now.
You think that. We'll get there when we get to this.
Okay.
You're a half step ahead of me, good sir. Denial of service attacks are the most basic form of cyber warfare, which does mean they are the easiest to defend against. But they're like, at least in the long term, let me rewind for a sec. The way DDoS attacks will generally work is they will almost always overwhelm something immediately. The question is how fast you can respond to them. So a lot of those places now have trained IT staff who can see, we're getting hit with this, we know generally what to look for, and they can design a workaround fairly quickly. Whereas before, they used to have to call 16 different tech firms, and people would look at it, and it would take forever. So they're faster at dealing with them, and they've come up with some filters that prevent it or just made bigger pipes, so it's less of a problem. But it still is something that happens from time to time. The important thing about these is they tend to be very intense but very short-lived. Right? You can do it, you can take a site offline for a little while, but it's very obvious it's happening. Unlike a lot of the other cyber weapons we might talk about, you know that your website is being shut down and you know that this is how it's happening. So if you've got the people on hand and the expertise, you can usually fix that problem with a fair amount of speed. Unlike other stuff where you may not even know it happened for a week or a month or a longer period of time. So to that extent, Dick, you're exactly right. We don't hear about this as much because we've developed not as much defenses to it as responses afterwards to minimize the impact of it. But even then, those sometimes aren't enough. And let's get to some examples of where these things have gone down. Estonia in 2007. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Who pays for this? Does the U.S. government pay for this? Like the defense?
The defense against cyber attacks? Individual companies do. Because they don't really want the US government poking around in all of their stuff and checking and reading all of their files to then protect them. They're probably sure there's some shady stuff going on in there. Do you think JP Morgan Chase is not worried about the federal government seeing every deal they are making everywhere? They probably are. So the companies do not tend to let the US government do it, and the US government hasn't allocated the resources to do that anyway. They protect government sites and government infrastructure on the federal level, but that's about it. And we'll get to this toward the very end because that actually creates some interesting problems for the US compared to some other countries. But Estonia, where we're going here, one of the big examples of this, in 2007, Russia, we're pretty sure, hit Estonia with a huge DDoS attack. It dropped Estonia's entire government offline, it dropped all of their media sites offline, it dropped their entire financial system offline for a prolonged period of time. Eventually they figured out what was going on, they found ways to get around it, but it was a huge issue for them and it really messed up their country for a while. One thing that you'll see repeated as we go through today is former Soviet bloc countries, in particular Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Georgia, Lithuania. These are kind of Russia's playground for testing out all of its cyber weapons, and they do it all the time. Ukraine, in particular, they're engaged in low-grade cyber warfare with Ukraine constantly, and that's where they test a lot of their stuff. But back in the day, Estonia was one of the ones that they hit. The other one that I wanted to point out was in 2006 called the Mirai attack. This went after the US. Specifically, it went after 26 US banks. We didn't hear all that much about this. It took them offline for a little while, but as we talked about, they were fairly good about getting back online fairly soon or finding workarounds, but it cost them a ton of money to try to deal with that and create a lot of problems. What's really interesting about this attack is it was done differently than any DDoS attack previously. So normally, when you're creating your botnet, right, you get a virus into somebody's computer and then it pings the server, like we talked about, right? Yeah? What they did here is they're like, we've got like antivirus programs on laptops and stuff. It's going to take a lot of work to get around those. But those laptops are not the only thing connected to the internet these days. Smart TVs. Some people have little robot vacuums that are connected. Your thermostat might be connected to the internet to check what the weather's looking like or for you to be able to adjust it from home. What's called the Internet of Things, if you've heard that term. It's basically everything that is not a computer or like a cell phone, which is basically a computer these days, that is connected to the internet. So any physical thing connected to the net that is not a computer type thing is part of the Internet of Things. And if they're not like a computer, we don't ever really interact with them all that much. Like you don't know if your smart fridge is running a little slow today. Like nobody knows or checks that kind of thing. So that means there isn't really any antivirus stuff for it. It also means that there's very little cybersecurity protection. In a lot of cases, there are ways that you can hook in and reprogram it. If you have to call in a technician to mess with your smart thermostat, they'll hook up a thing to it and then they'll mess around with it. So you can get into the actual computer software in there, but you can't do it you yourself. You need a professional to come in and do it generally. But they can also get to it via the internet. So they got to tons of smart devices, and they told all of those things to ping a website over and over and over. So your smart fridge was pinging JP Morgan Chase or US Bank and trying to take them offline. And partially because they were using those things instead of normal computers, it took people a lot more time to figure out where it was coming from and why and how they could deal with it. So this was just particularly interesting because it was very clever and it was unexpected. And today we still have very little, if any, cybersecurity protection on those devices. Because in a lot of cases, the passwords for them are just whatever was programmed in initially. If there's a default password, they never change them because it takes work and it takes time to change them. And why would a company bother doing that if it's not going to hurt them if they don't? It'll hurt somebody else, but so what do I care if Wells Fargo goes offline for a while? I'm Maytag. Why does it matter to me? So this is one of the other problems that comes with sort of private ownership of targeted devices, is that if people are able to get your device to do their work for them, and you don't have the ability to secure it, and the company who made it doesn't have any incentive to secure it, who does? That's the Internet of Things thing. So I expect we will see more of this kind of thing in the future. And as of now, we don't have any good solution to it. No one has decided it is worthwhile enough to spend the resources to deal with it. Yeah? We believe so, but this one we are less sure about. But yeah, we believe so. So that's DDoS attacks. That's taking websites offline, basically. Seconds, and for all of these things, I'm simplifying things a little bit, so what I'm telling you is about 95% accurate, but the other 5% would take 2.5 hours to explain, so if there are a few things that feel like they're not quite there, ask me at the end. I'm happy to clarify. Next, file damage. This is one of the other big areas where cyber weapons are used. You've got two basic categories here. The first category is what's called a wiper. This is something that gets onto your system, so it gets into your computer, and it wipes out your hard drive. All of your pictures, all of your files, all of your programs, gone. And it'll do that in a couple of ways. It can either do that by just telling your computer to erase all of that. It can do that by encrypting data. Is encryption a concept folks are familiar with from a digital perspective? Anyone got sort of a vague definition? If I say a file's encrypted, what's that mean? Any guesses? Yeah. Yeah.
In a way that you have to know the code to read.
Bingo. It's, yeah, exactly it. I've taken the file, I've sort of scrambled it around, and you need a specific code to unscramble it and put it back in an order where it can be read. Encryption is just basically encoding something, very straight up. So think back to like the Enigma machine in World War II. Same sort of concept there, not computer-oriented, but there we're taking a message and we're scrambling it around. And if you don't have the specific way to unscramble it, you don't know what it means. Nowadays, most well, we'll talk about communication file stuff in a bit, but encryption on a computer, one of the options they can do here is if the wiper gets into your system, it can encrypt all of your stuff and then delete the key. And then you're just left going, well, I have my stuff, but I can't read it or use any of it. Crap. And trying to reproduce the keys for these sorts of things is largely impossible. Like the amount of time it would take to try every solution will literally take hundreds or thousands of years of a computer running full steam doing nothing but that. So if your data is strongly encrypted and that encryption key is deleted, it is basically gone. Even though they didn't directly wipe it, it has the same effect. That's generally how wiper types. One of the other options is they can actually, you know, when your computer boots up, you get that initial like loading screen, like I got on mine when it wouldn't actually load. They can mess with that, so the computer will never be able to figure out how to load itself up again, which also denies your information. So those are wipers. There's a couple examples that are a big deal. One was what was called Shamoon. This was something that Iran put together, and they hit Saudi Aramco with a few years back. So Saudi Aramco is the kingdom, it's the oil company for Saudi Arabia, the state-owned oil company. Processes more oil than anything else in the world. And what Shamoon did was it got into some of their systems, and then at a predetermined time, fairly quickly after it got in, wiped everything on pretty much every computer they can get to. So people in the building, took them maybe 5 or 10 minutes to figure out what was going on, but as soon as they realized it, they were trying to desperately unplug computers so they wouldn't execute the program. They lost, I think, more than 2/3 of all of their computers, and all of their data was gone. Shipping manifests to everywhere, inventory lists, payroll, communications, trade secrets, how much oil is supposed to be pumped where, all the geological references they may have done to dig new oil wells, gone. It took them months to recover from this. So that's an example of the kind of chaos that these programs can wreck. And again, we are 95 to 98% sure that was Iran, but they're like, wasn't us. Can you prove it? Probably not. The other example, this is a huge one. This was called NotPetya. There was a previous cyber weapon called Petya, and this was similar to it, but it was not that, so they called it NotPetya because hackers are cute like that. This was something that Russia created, well, sort of. This is something that Russia deployed. And they deployed it to target Ukraine's banking system in particular. Banks are one of the areas that are most vulnerable because nowadays, I mean, you all know this, there are a lot of people who, like, I very rarely carry much in the way of cash. Like, credit card or debit card is how I do most of my stuff. It's becoming more and more common for younger generations than for older generations, but also in terms of banking, banks these days almost all, they don't have bricks of gold in a vault somewhere, right? It's ones and zeros that tell us how much money different people have in accounts different places. And if you can't access that, you can't move money around, and that's a huge problem. So NotPetya targeted Ukraine's banks, tried to wipe out a bunch of the information there. But what was interesting about this one is, unlike Shamoon, which was pretty directly targeted, like it was set up to only go after Saudi Aramco. Like it went after a particular type of software that only they had and only their stuff. NotPetya went after a kind of accounting software that a lot of people used, and it was designed to self-propagate, to copy itself and send itself out, like the stuff we talked about earlier. So Russia sent it at Ukraine, and it hit there, and then it spread pretty much everywhere else. This is the single most costly cyber attack in the history of the world, as far as we know. About $10 billion worth of damage was done here. Some of it actually even looped back and hit a firm in Russia as well. This is kind of the equivalent of carpet bombing or chemical warfare, where you never know where the wind is going to blow it after you drop it, even if you dropped it on a particular target. Yeah?
When you say Russia, does that mean it's coming from the Kremlin?
Do you want to ask them that question? Because they'll say, "Нет, definitely not from Kremlin. We have many things, but we not use this. It absolutely is probably Ukraine. Yes, we have nothing to do with it. It's independent Russian patriots that have no affiliation with us whatsoever, even if possibly they may have been training with us and were working with KGB until about 2 days ago. Now they are not with us. They be rehired in 3 days. It's fine." Yeah, you know. So NotPetya was a few years back, but this is an instance where Russia actually has a couple different branches that do cyber warfare. There's the SRB, which is what the KGB became. There is, I can't remember the acronym for it, but it's the Army's branch. GRU. There it is. Thank you very much. The GRU also does a bunch of that, which is kind of the Army's cyber branch. And then they also have some that are kind of only sort of affiliated in a deniable kind of way. The Internet Research Agency it's a great title for what is basically what we call a troll farm. It is a bunch of kids with, not kids, but people in their 20s at computers typing stuff and messing with the planet. That one is not officially affiliated with any of them, but pretty much is. Yeah?
Is this the same sources for your ransomware that's flying around?
Getting there in just a half second. That's actually the next bit. That was Wannacry. So again, half step ahead of me. Great question. But this one, yeah, goes all over the place. officially not state-sponsored, but yeah, almost certainly actually state-sponsored. But the part of what makes this so interesting is, again, not just the amount of damage that it did, but that it ended up spreading in an uncontrolled fashion to such a large degree. There are different amounts of precision that you can get with cyber weapons. The US tends to err on the side of using very precise cyber weapons to target a very specific thing, partially because we've got so much out there that if we like did the carpet bombing approach, it's really likely some of it blows back to us. So we tend to target things more specifically. The more narrow your country's interests are, the more likely it is that other people are going to be the victim of a less discriminate attack than you. So Russia, North Korea, they tend to be much more broad scale in their attacks.
What year did the Russians release non-cap?
I believe that was 2016 or 2017. I'm not positive. I'll have to double check on that. Next chunky category is ransomware. This is very similar to a wiper, except it does one more thing. It encrypts all your data, like we talked about, and then a screen comes up on your computer that says, "Hi, I just encrypted all your data. If you want it back, go to this website and transfer $200 worth of Bitcoin, which is an electronic currency, basically, that's pretty much untraceable. Go to this website, give me a bunch of money, and then I'll give you the code. You can have your data back. If you don't do that in 48 hours, I'll delete the code and you will never get your stuff back." Greatest example of that, or at least most current example, is Wannacry. Yes, again, hackers are cute. This was something that North Korea threw out initially, though other people have also messed with similar stuff. It was ransomware that North Korea deployed to a bunch of places. They actually made millions of dollars off of this, because if you're a company, you kind of have to get that info back, or it's going to cost you a lot more than what the ransom would cost, so why not just pay it? In some cases with ransomware, you pay and you get your stuff back. Sometimes you pay and they're just like, "That's cute, I deleted it anyway." So you never really know, but that's kind of the other category of stuff. Both of these, it's generally very obvious when you're under attack, unlike the first category. Well, the first category and the second category, both denial of service and file damage, those are pretty obvious. In the last category, some of those are a lot more subtle, so we'll get there in a sec. But these are wipers and ransomware. Any questions on these and how they work? Yeah.
Wannacry is the one that got the National Health Service.
Yep, that's the one that basically shut down a lot of Britain's National Health Service, and huge deal there. That's where some of these things can actually indirectly lead to deaths, right? If all of the charts for all of your patients get deleted, you're going to have a hard time triaging people as they come in, and that can actually get people killed. But it's not getting people killed as directly as dropping a bomb on them would be, so it's seen as a less than warfare kind of thing, because it's harder to attribute. Yeah?
You said targeting everybody. Did you just throw it out into the internet and anybody got
Sort of.
crucified or something?
Kind of, honestly, yeah. For this one, yeah, they went for anything that they could get into. Because again, for a lot of these, you still have to find a way to get it into the system in question, right? Sometimes you can do the email thing and then just hope people click on the link or download the attachment. Those are what are called phishing emails. It's like you're phishing, except they spell it with a PH because hackers are cute. It's like you're phishing for something. So those are phishing emails, and you just hope that like you throw a billion of them out there and you hope that 10 people click on the link, and if they do, you're into those computers, and that may be enough to get a foothold to keep going. There's also what's called spear phishing, which, I know, there are lots of fun ones. Spear phishing, instead of just like throwing out a net and seeing what comes up, which is the send emails to everyone, spear phishing is, I'm gonna like look at your emails, I'm gonna find out info about you, I'm gonna research you, I'm gonna figure out who your friends are, what your job is, how old you are, what your hobbies are, and then I'm gonna send an email to you that looks like it's coming from one of your friends, asking about one of your hobbies and saying, would you click on this link? I think it's interesting because it deals with rose gardening. And you're like, oh, I like rose gardening, yeah, Tim sent that to me, cool, click, and now you're hosed. So spear phishing takes a lot more effort to do and a lot more work. It's only done for high-value targets usually. So this is when John Podesta with the Democratic National Committee, when his email got hacked, it was a spear phishing attempt that got him. They did a bunch of research on him, sent an email that looked like it was coming from an entirely legitimate source, that looked like it was coming actually from Google, that said, you have to reset your password, type in the new password and stuff, and they did it, and then the hackers had that password and game over. So for some things, you do that kind of thing. You just throw it all out there and see what sticks. But for a lot of these things, you find a vulnerability in a system and try to get into it that way. Last category, and these are the ones that are kind of the most spectacular, the ones that make die-hard movies out of themselves. Physical damage attacks. This is where I'm at my computer over here, I hack into the computer over there, and because of that, I cause that computer to physically damage a thing in the real world. There are a couple sort of a couple ways that this can work. One is a hijacker kind of effect. This is where I get into your computer and make it so you can't do anything, and I'm the one who's running your computer from where I'm at. So when I move my mouse, the mouse on your screen moves around, and when you type keys, nothing happens. Great example of this, so your rerouting control, was what was called black energy. Again, Russia targeting Ukraine, because they do that. And this is where Russia targeted Ukraine's power grid. They basically shut down about half the power in the state of Ukraine and the entire nation of Ukraine for a while. And Ukrainian people, they had to actually find places where there were manual switches they could flip in order to change stuff. And as we develop things and as we become more efficient, we switch from a lot of those to computer systems because 99% of the time they are more efficient, they are less costly, and they do the job better, but they do have this kind of vulnerability. So that was an instance, and this is sort of the nightmare scenario for a lot of governments. Taking out a power grid is utterly crippling. Like we don't think about it all that much. We assume like if we lose power, it's annoying. If it happens during the winter, it's super annoying. But whatever. But then think hospitals, think traffic lights, think airports, especially if you have planes already incoming. All kinds of big things that can happen there. That doesn't even touch on what you can do to the military if you can mess with their power supply. So power grid attacks are one of the really big concerns on the top of the US's list of cyber vulnerabilities to look at. Our power grid is stupidly vulnerable. We have done very little to protect it because it's just not, we haven't made it a priority yet. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Part of it is for a lot of these things, because remember, cyber weapons, they only work the one time generally, which means you're almost always fighting the last battle, not the next battle, because you don't know where the next one's going to come from usually. So for these kinds of things, until the event actually happens, it's really tough to believe it can happen and to spend a lot of money to make something not happen. Because then you can say, we spent all this money, what did you get for it? I don't know. Like, maybe they weren't attacking us in the first place. Who knows, right? It's a lot easier to spend money to respond to something that just did happen. That's why we give a lot more disaster relief aid than we ever do disaster prevention aid. Even though disaster prevention would be a lot more effective, we can see flooded cities and people desperately in need of help, and that moves us to give aid. But we don't see things right beforehand when those conditions are building. So in the same way, a lot of why we haven't secured a lot of the facilities here is because it's tough to get the political will to do that when you have to either raise people's taxes, which most politicians really don't want to do, or cut other programs where people have interests in them or there are other benefits. So we need to do more prevention, and we're not doing it. Yeah?
How about cutting like some of these CEOs' profits?
But the government doesn't, well, via taxes we could do that, but then you have to not be lobbied by those CEOs and be giving campaign contributions by those CEOs to not do that.
I mean, the other issue is, the capital, the stocks aren't taxed.
Nope, agreed. Plenty of options, but we have decided politically as a nation that we do not want to do that, or at least the people we have elected have decided that.
Again, is that politically or is that manipulative?
I see those two terms as often interchangeable. But I do think it is, I don't think that's the result of some sort of cyber attack. I think that's the result of people looking out for what they believe are their political interests, and this is a whole other discussion we could have on another day if we had time, but the way our campaign financing system is set up, for most people, for most politicians, getting people with lots of money to approve of what you're doing is the best way to be reelected, regardless of what the general populace thinks, because you need money to campaign. So those two end up, unfortunately, being entwined.
Also, prevention is not sexy.
Absolutely, right? You don't get those heroic images of people charging in to rescue puppies from the water. You just get like some people at a computer preventing a thing that may never have happened because we don't know. Yep, you're absolutely right. It's all about how we can sell it. So, you've got hijacker options, which we talked about. Then you have saboteur options. These are ones that are in some ways more insidious. The hijacker one, that lets you take control and shut things down or move things around or do whatever you want to. Saboteur stuff, you don't have to be actively involved. Once the program goes in, it does its thing. And what it does can be particularly devastating. Perhaps the best example of this as something that causes physical damage to a computer or attached system, we'll get to in a sec. Sorry, I want to finish there. A saboteur program, so laptop, right? I assume some of you all either have had or used laptops at various times, yeah? You ever notice when sometimes it gets really hot and your lap gets a little annoying, right? And there's the fan that goes in the computer as well that keeps it cool. Anyone ever had one of those fans stop working on their computer? What happens?
Temperature goes up and it starts almost burning.
Yeah, temperature goes up high enough, it will literally start melting the components inside your computer. So if I can get into your computer and tell it to turn off the fan and start doing as many calculations as it can so it generates as much heat as possible, I can possibly wreck your entire computer. That's the kind of stuff we're doing here. So saboteur programs will get into a computer and cause it to damage itself or to damage equipment that it is attached to. And here's the classic example, and this is arguably one of the most impressive cyber attacks in history so far. What's called Stuxnet. Yep, or Operation Olympic Games was the term that the US intelligence community gave to it while they were putting it together. What Stuxnet did, it is unofficially work of the US and Israel. They, of course, say, we don't know who did that utterly beautiful and perfect piece of work. No clue who that dashingly handsome person and country was. But Stuxnet was the US and Israel, and it actually ended up getting deployed all the way back in 2007. It took it years to actually get into the field and do its thing. But it was what's called a worm. It's like a virus, except we're not getting into the difference. It functions like a virus. It's a piece of malware. It gets into your computer. And then what it did is the Iranians at this point were developing nuclear fuel. They said they didn't want a nuclear weapon. In reality, they were almost certainly developing enough enriched uranium that they could either get right next to having a nuclear weapon or actually get one. The way you enrich uranium is you take so when you get a hunk of uranium, you can't like hit it with a hammer and make it go boom, right? There's a lot more that goes into making a nuke than that. You have to take, what's that? Yeah, no kidding. So any of those movies where you see people like shooting a bullet at a nuclear weapon and then being afraid it'll explode, it doesn't work that way. But you have to take the uranium, and there's only one small part of it you want, a particular isotope. So it's a particular version of uranium that is more likely to split apart and run into other things. So when a nuclear reaction happens, you got a piece of uranium, you split it, and both of those pieces go hit other chunks of uranium. They split and go hit other things, and they go hit other things and other things, and boom. If you ever hear the term critical mass applied, that means you have enough mass, you have enough weight or stuff of that kind of uranium for the reaction to cascade. Because if you only have a little bit, it goes a little while and then it doesn't do enough for the whole thing to go and actually get you a nuclear explosion. Nuclear weapons are kind of like pregnancy. You either have an explosion or you don't. You're pregnant or you're not. You don't have a kind of nuclear explosion. You get one or you don't. So in order to make that kind of nuclear weapon, you have to take the normal uranium you would dig up, and you have to do what's called enriching it. Enriching uranium is where you're trying to separate out the small amount of it that's the isotope that you want, and then you pretty much get rid of the rest. You do that by putting it in a centrifuge and spinning around super fast, and that eventually will separate the little bit that you want from all the stuff you don't want. Then you dump that out, take the little bit you want, you put it in another centrifuge, and you do it again. And you keep enriching and enriching to increase the percentage of the stuff that you have that's the isotope you're looking for. Y'all with me in general? So if you hear about, for example, like 30% enriched uranium, that means you've got a hunk of uranium, and 30% of it is the kind of isotope that can do nuclear stuff. When you get to higher levels of enrichment, you can do more in different things. So nuclear reactors generally need lower levels of enrichment, at least most of them. There are other ways to do this, but I'm focusing on this one for right now. The nuclear reactors generally need lower levels. We're talking 30 to 50% enrichment or less. Once you go above 50% enrichment, there's not a ton you can really do with it other than nuclear weapons. There's some high-end medical research with like X-rays and stuff that around 70% or so you can do. But for a nuclear weapon, we're looking at 90, 95% plus enrichment. So what was happening in Iran is they were saying, we want to make the kind of nuclear fuel that we need for power plants. And the world was like, okay, cool. But you realize that you only need like 30 or 40% enrichment. You're making 50 and 60% enrichment. What gives? And part of the issue is the same centrifuges that will get you to 30% can get you to 90%. So the concern is always, because they have the equipment, we don't know what exactly they will do with that. You all with me in the general idea? Question?
Oh, no,
Okay. Yay! Preemptive answers. We'll talk about preemptive warfare and preemptive responses in a bit. This is an example of preventative, not preemptive. But so you have to spin it around to enrich the uranium. However, when something is moving that fast, little bitty changes make a big difference, right? So the faster it's going, the more a little change can cause damage. What Stuxnet did is it got into the systems. It was designed it could get into pretty much any system. It could get onto pretty much any computer. But the only thing it would change, the only thing it interacted with, was a very specific program that worked to control the rate at which centrifuges spun and the angle at which they were rotated. That was only used in a few very specific nuclear power plants, namely the ones in Iran, and the mock-ups of those that we in Israel built to test it. but we don't talk about those. So program got in there, and then it just altered the angle a little bit, which meant that once they started spinning, they became unstable, and they broke and shattered a bunch of the centrifuges and damaged a bunch of the equipment. And what you're doing is delicate enough that you don't really know the first few times that happens. Did someone just screw the thing on wrong? Did someone not check the controls here? So it took them over a year to realize that what was happening was actually a cyber attack. It just looked like a few small glitches that crop up from time to time when you do these things. Eventually, they realized what was going on. They found a way to get around it, but it set their nuclear program back by at least a year, probably more. That's an example of a saboteur-based cyber weapon, and arguably one of the most effective ones that's been developed or deployed.
Is this information promulgated so that we know about,
It wasn't intended to be, but eventually it was. There are two things. Edward Snowden, if you're familiar with him, he released a bunch of information. He got a bunch of information from the Pentagon and the NSA and released a bunch of that information to WikiLeaks and then to the public. And that basically explained a bunch of the different things that the NSA and other government agencies were doing. It's what let us know the government was doing a whole bunch of spying on US citizens they were not actually authorized to do. And he said that was the reason he released it. You can argue about his motivations, but that was his argument. It also showed that this was a thing that we had done. There was another release that happened in 2017, we'll talk about in a bit, by another group that also let us know some of this. But this is by leaked stuff. Yeah, in the back.
What happened was there was a programming error in Stuxnet,
Mm-hmm.
and it actually
Yep, got into the wild.
and got into the wild.
Mhm.
It was targeted just at Iranian
Mhm.
nuclear facilities.
Yep.
But there was some kind of a bug, and then it started spreading around, and then an antivirus company,
Yep.
I think in Russia,
Kaspersky. Yep.
analyzed it
Yep.
and figured out what was going on.
And the US and Israel said, we don't know anything about that. And then the releases of documents came and they're like, oh, well, okay, maybe we do. Maybe.
There's been some good coverage on that in both Frontline
Yep.
and 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
Did a really nice piece
They
on
have.
it a few years ago. This was all before Snowden.
Yep. So that was, at that point, it was all speculation. The confirmation didn't come until actual NSA documents got released that proved that they did it. Prior to that, it was a lot of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Totally wasn't us, but wasn't that awesome? And then we ended up getting confirmation later on. But part of the other thing, in terms of it getting into the wild, part of what made this operation was actually fascinating in terms of how they did it. Because Iran, they're not idiots, right? They know that we're probably going to try to mess with their nuclear facilities, so they have what's called an their systems were not connected to the outside. In order to use it, you had to physically get there and use the computer. You couldn't connect from the outside. So we needed to get somebody to either physically get it onto a computer there, or we needed to find some other way to get it on without being able to use the internet. We don't know exactly what method was used to get it there, but in all likelihood, it was either that we basically put it on a thumb drive, a little flash drive, and we arranged for someone to accidentally put that in because we swapped it for one that they actually had. We actually were looking into interesting ways to use radio waves to transmit some code into a receiver program. I don't know if that ever came to fruition. But yeah, it's fascinating how we did it. And part of the idea was because it was going to get into this system and that system isn't connected to the outside, we don't have to worry about it going anywhere else. But eventually it ended up getting to the outside and people picked it up just like you said, Dick. So that's kind of the idea with Stuxnet. You had a question as well, sir?
That was it.
Oh, fair enough.
They get in.
There you go. It's a good question. There's actually a book I'm going to recommend at the end that is really, really good on this topic. It lays out all the history really well in a really accessible way. I read it partially in preparation for this, and I'd recommend it to people. But in terms of damages, we have those two. There's one other area that, of not file damage, but physical damage that you can see in cyber weapons, and that's what's vaguely called a mass shutdown. This is, in some ways, just sort of a combination of a bunch of smaller things. One second. But this, the example of this that I'm going to point to is something that has not ever actually been deployed, but again, because of leaked documents, we know exists. And that's something called Nitro Zeus. Again, hackers are fun. Operation Nitro Zeus was something that the United States had designed as a first strike on Iran. The idea is if we ever have to actually go to war with Iran, as we are getting ready to have our planes lift off, we hit them with this. And what it was intended to do is shut down power grids, shut down all their surface-to-air sites, black out all their communications, basically shut down the country to enable bombers to go in without being shot down, to prevent coordinated retaliation, any of that kind of stuff. We don't know how effective it would be. In all likelihood, probably fairly effective. The US government treated it as a highly classified secret, again, until it got leaked. And again, we've never deployed it, but it is something that we have developed and theoretically could use. So this is sort of the whole other category of cyber weaponry, which is cyber weaponry that's designed to be used as part of a combat situation or part of a war. Yeah.
Can we not be the same type?
Oh, totally. Yeah, we're absolutely vulnerable to everything I've been outlining here. And we actually been hit by a fair amount of it too, which we'll talk about. But something like this, we could get hit with this, but part of the issue is this kind of thing, this is no longer short of war, right? Somebody does this, we either assume it is the beginning of a strike, or we will likely treat that as an act of war against the US, and we're gonna blow up somebody. Might not be the right people, we're gonna blow up somebody. And nobody wants to take the chance that it might be them. So far, no one has tried something like that.
Just a comment.
Yeah.
Iran and some of the other countries
Mhm.
that we might attack are looking to seal themselves off
Mhm.
from the internet.
Yeah.
So that we can't get to them in the event that we're trying to attack them.
Yeah.
They'll just completely cut them off, and their internet will only be internal.
And that's something that actually serves a dual purpose. If you're in an autocratic state, you have every incentive to make sure your people can't access the rest of the world. China, they have a lot of access, but they control it really strongly. This is a more abrupt shutoff. I hadn't heard about Iran. North Korea, yeah, they only have a few major exits to the rest of the world, and those are highly controlled. So there is a defensive benefit from that, in addition to the sort of political benefit of preventing or at least locking down dissent. So absolutely, good observation. And it's something that some countries would have the option to do, but we in the US would never have the option to do because it would affect all of our business stuff and all of our communications and our daily life too much for the American people to ever accept that as an option. Though, depending on how all this stuff goes, in the long run, that may end up becoming something that gets considered. Though I'm expecting that things like being able to breach air gaps, like being able to do wireless transmissions of stuff, may end up getting around that. We just don't know how well developed that tech is yet. So, these are pretty much the top of the line, big boom options in terms of cyber warfare. Any questions on any of these? Under a chair, bunker, any place that has an analog clock with hands like that instead of a digital one. Yeah, go for it.
Off the grid, Vermont.
Yeah, there you go.
A number of years, about 3 years ago, I
Yeah.
heard a lecture. This was a cybersecurity expert.
Probably much better at it than me.
And he talked about that we all, meaning the big powers,
Mhm.
US, Russia, China, other countries,
Mhm.
have the ability to shut down everything. And it's only by mutual annihilation agreement.
Yeah.
They understand if they shut us down
Mhm.
with what you had said.
Yeah.
Is there anything formal there? Is there some kind of, that's
Nope.
just, I'm
Yep.
taking your word that you're not going to shut us down.
It's more that I know you won't risk it. It's not that I think you're a good person, not you specifically. It's not that I think I trust my opponents and think they're good. It's that I trust they want to survive too. It's the same thing that kept the US and the Soviets from nuking each other in the Cold War. Exactly, mutually assured destruction. The catch, though, and this is where that starts to break down, is with a ballistic missile, physics gives it a return address, right? We know exactly where that frickin' thing comes from, and we will turn that place into glass. There is not necessarily a return address. Something as widespread as like Nitro Zeus, that there probably would be. But a lot of smaller things, it's hard to definitively pin down. And so that mutually assured destruction only works when we know we can figure out who it was in order to destroy them. If you can't figure out who it is, you can't blow them up. And if I know you can't find me, I have every incentive to hit you first. Yeah.
Just popped into my head.
Yeah.
Is there any plans or thought about doing a non-computer driven kind of agency? Or, in other words, our vulnerability is clearly tied to the computer.
Yeah.
And if you had the Air Force,
Yeah.
instead of using computers, you use primitive
Yeah.
celestial shooting.
Sure.
You can still navigate. You don't
Yep.
have to use their navigation.
Yeah.
Is there anything out there that says countries are doing that?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, the US Department of Redundancy or something along those lines, like redundancy in a positive sense, and that it's a backup for other things. It would make a lot of sense. The big issue, I think, is the amount of stuff that would have to go into that and the amount of efficiency we would lose and the fact that it would be disconnected from everyone else and would kind of need to work on its own, I think so far has made that unappealing, but there may be some merit to that. Yeah.
Well, I think it plays into our election system. I mean, you do hear a lot of discussion about
Yes.
having all of our ballot stuff attached to the internet, so having paperback, all that
Mhm.
kind of stuff. So that thought process is definitely there.
Yeah. Yep.
But what I think they've done is the Secretary of State's office, you have so many days to register online, and then it's like 6 days before the election, they print out, every city and town is required to print out their list of voters.
Yep. In Massachusetts, I think so, but different states do their own thing, but yeah.
And, they said that we had to print it out. And so there's no like, oh, you're not on the voting list. There's no keying it in, because it's a physical piece of paper you're going to have to check off with. Because that's one of the things they want to make sure nobody comes in at the last minute and all of a sudden 500 people trying to vote and 350 can't vote because you're not a registered voter.
And during the 2016 election, as far as we know, none of the voting machines were messed with, and we're pretty confident that that's the case. But we do know that agents from Russia managed to penetrate the voter rolls in a number of places, and that risks exactly what you're talking about, which is them going in and just deleting a bunch of people from there. So that, especially if they can do that like county by county or area by area, they can affect which areas can vote and which ones can't, and that can swing elections easily. And it's the sort of thing that may look like a glitch if you do it selectively enough, which is one of the hallmarks of cyber warfare.
The federal government has allocated in the state has done for that. It's not that
it's far insufficient, but it's there. Yeah.
But there are things that are in place.
Yeah. There's a bill that the House has passed that McConnell has declined to take up in the Senate, which would have allocated a lot of money for election security. And there's not been a really good explanation that I have heard for why election security is bad. Or why it is not worth funding, but that's been Mitch McConnell's call. It's got, I think, somewhere around 70-ish% support in the country for it. So
Moscow Mitch.
that was one of the major reasons that moniker showed up. Yeah, go for it.
Was there any voting? What do you call it? The number of voters or the people who vote? Were any of them deleted?
Not that we know of. No. We know that they got in. We don't think they actually changed anything in there. But remember, for a lot of this stuff, once you deploy a cyber weapon, that makes it a lot easier for people to figure out what you're able to do. So there is an incentive oftentimes to scout your target and then just sit back and wait.
So what did Russia actually or supposed to do in the...
Let's cover this a bit. So 2016, here is what we know. And actually the Senate and the FBI, like the Mueller report, aside from all the political aspects when it comes to Trump and stuff there, a huge chunk of that report is, like the whole first chunk, is all about the way in which Russia messed with our population during the election. And it's super serious, and there's a lot that happened. The big things that happened are these. Russia created a bunch of fake accounts on social media sites that posed as actual Americans and used those to ramp up discord, frustration, and anger in the US. So a lot of that, and this is what we refer to as trolling, which is where someone says something just to get a reaction out of someone else. It's what 2-year-olds do. It's part of why I don't have kids, I have puppies. But trolling is just trying to get reactions out of people, and it's usually just an annoying thing that jerks on the internet do. Russia weaponized that in that they actively tried to find points of discord and widen those. They also did, there's a great example where they posed as people living in Texas, and they set up a rally. I think it was Texans opposed to Sharia law. And then, which no one is actually advocating for existing in Texas, but they created this whole thing where they said people were really worried about it, and a bunch of physical people showed up at a rally that was, what was that?
I think it was 4,000.
Yeah, it was huge. And it was organized by people in Russia posing as Americans. And the brilliant part of it is they not only did that, they organized a counter rally as well, which was people for Muslim rights in America that also had a bunch of people show up, and they had Americans yelling and screaming at each other, coming close to violence. All of that without setting foot inside the country. That's the kind of thing that's happening. The second thing that's happening is the proliferation of fake news. That term has been twisted by the Trump administration to mean any news that the president disagrees with. But the way that the term was initially deployed was about people creating a story that is flat out false and then disseminating that as if it were actually true. One of the classic ones during the 2016 election was that Pope Francis endorsed Donald Trump. He did not. But that story was more shared on social media than a heck of a lot of true stories. And actually they looked, I wish I had the stat on this, they looked at the top 10 stories that trended the most on Facebook during the 2016 election. I believe 5 or 6 of them were flat out fake, that were deliberately presented to try to skew things. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I thought affected the election was that just a month or so earlier, there was like an investigation against Clinton.
Yep, I'm working backwards. That's the next bit. And this is what we mentioned with hacking Podesta's emails earlier. What was most likely the Russians, we're pretty sure, actually via the Mueller report, we're certain. Russians got into the Democratic National Committee servers. They got access to Hillary Clinton's campaign chief's emails, stole all those emails, handed them over to WikiLeaks, and had WikiLeaks release them right after the Access Hollywood tape, Trump describing sexual assault. Right after the day after that came out, Russia then dumped WikiLeaks then dumped all of those emails to try to stir up anger at John Podesta, and it actually worked really well to distract from that issue. Similar kinds of things happened with other embarrassing stuff that they turned up. So, yeah.
What I'm thinking of was, maybe you answered it, but there was an investigation by Comey.
Yeah, that one was distinct from Russia in that.
And then, about a month later, they said there was nothing to it.
Yeah, let me run through that real quick because that's not directly related here, but it did play into all of what went on, and a lot of these things got merged together in people's minds, which is part of what created a lot of this distrust and confusion. So Hillary Clinton, back when she was Secretary of State, the department rules say that when you've got email, you store it on the standard State Department server. But there isn't anything that says that you can't also have a separate server somewhere else, except maybe there kind of is. It's a little unclear. Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State before Hillary Clinton, had stored some emails privately, some of them publicly. There have only been 2 Secretaries of State, or 2 or 3 during the time that we have had email, so there hasn't been a lot that's been locked down in terms of procedure. Anyway, Clinton took a bunch of those email, a bunch of her stuff, and stored it on a private secured server rather than on the State Department server. Why she did that? My guess, this is just my opinion, not necessarily objective fact. My guess is that there are probably things, as is the case with any set of emails, that might make her look bad, even if there's nothing illegal in there. And she is, I think, somewhat paranoid, perhaps with good reason, about people trying to create scandals around her and weaponize those, because she is, I'm going to set aside that commentary. I think that she is concerned about that. And I think that concern led her to be somewhat paranoid in terms of setting those emails in a different place than they should have been. This is where the investigation with Comey came in. Did she break any laws in doing that? The way the law works is if she knew it was something that was illegal and did it for the purposes of concealing stuff, that would potentially be a crime. Comey's conclusion was we don't have any evidence that shows she knew it was illegal because her predecessors had done some versions of it as well. So while it was very careless, it was not technically something that we can prosecute and think we can win. So no prosecution. Then right before the election, like within, I think it was a week or two right beforehand, one of her aides had a laptop also that had some emails on it. Yep, and then they were going after Anthony Weiner, who was the husband of one of her aides, who has his own whole set of thing. In a separate investigation going after him, they found some emails on a laptop and like, oh, these are also ones we should look to make sure they're not duplicates of what we already have, make sure there isn't anything that shouldn't be here that is here. The big concern was whether she had taken information that was classified or top secret in some way and had put it someplace where it was more vulnerable to being stolen. It turned out, and actually this is something that's unfolding right now in the State Department, the US State Department is retroactively classifying information right now. They're going back and saying, these emails, we are now determining these to be classified. And we're determining some of the information in them to have been secretive. They were not classified at the time, but anyone who shared them is potentially open to criminal prosecution because we have now decided they are classified. Whether that will hold up in court is a big question, but it is something that is a narrative that is being developed to be deployed in 2020 in all likelihood.
They've done that in the past. They've done that in the past.
On the same scale?
On the same scale.
Wow, I was not familiar with that.
And things like that.
Fair. This, I suppose the big difference is
That have been released to the public, and then they say, oh no, that's a classified study.
fair. The prosecution of people who've less,
Prosecutors,
yeah.
but to try to restrict those.
And here, I didn't think about those details, so fair point. My understanding, at least of this situation, is that the things that are being restricted seem somewhat arbitrary, and that sets it in potentially a different setting than scientific information that's relevant to weapons systems, but that's at least part of what's going on now. Jumping back, guys, I kind of got a little off track there. Jumping back, what happened, so they checked out those emails. It turned out that there were a few things that, I think there were like 5 or 7 that technically had a level of classification that weren't officially marked that way, so there's no reason to believe that there was intentional negligence. Out of all of these, a few of them may have gotten through, none of them had anything tremendously sensitive, but the refrain of, but her emails, was a really big deal, and that shaped public perception, and that was a part of what happened in terms of turning the election. the FBI making public statements about it. James Comey is a very polarizing figure for a couple good reasons on both sides. I think that I've actually read his book, and it's interesting. I don't know that I agree with all of his stuff, but it's interesting seeing the perspective that he's espousing. His argument was that so he found out that there was a laptop that might have new stuff 2 weeks before the election. And he said, I've got a choice. I do one of two things. Either I don't say anything about this, and then if it comes out later that there was a thing that we could have investigated and didn't, it will destroy the credibility of the FBI, and I can't risk that. Or I go ahead and say it, which is not ideal because we don't like to do this stuff this close to the election. FBI policy is you don't release things that are politically oriented really close to an election. But that is less of a risk because he figured there was a good chance it was probably going to leak at some point, either in the next administration or whenever. He figured that would do less harm than trying to conceal it. Don't know that I agree with the decision there, but that was his explanation for how he made it, and that in all likelihood did have an effect on the election. Don't know if it was decisive, but likely had an effect. Yes?
Well, Comey got up on the soapbox in July of 2006, contrary to Department of Justice policy, and went on a rant about why Hillary Clinton had so badly handled classified information. And the FBI policy always was, if there's no action taken, we say nothing.
Yep.
So
And
you started off in July of 2016, and then you did this backflip.
Yep. And again, the rationale that he gives, I don't know that I buy it, but his rationale is because there was information about the thing out there in the public eye, if we didn't say anything about it, it would be seen as a conspiracy and it would be painted as something that degraded the credibility of the FBI in a significant way. So he said he believed that it was necessary for him to say something, and he saw this as sort of splitting the difference in that he was announcing that they weren't going to do anything, but he was also announcing that I understand why people see this as sketchy, and we agree there were some problems, but none of those were problems that legal prosecution is merited for. Again, I'm not certain that that was the best decision. It definitely differs from what the FBI usually does. He claimed it was a unique situation. We can argue about that till the cows come home. But that's part of what happened there. Jumping back to the cyber end of things in terms of cybersecurity, because all this is fascinating, but a whole other thing. Back to the cybersecurity end, in terms of securing voting infrastructure, the main things that are at risk here are voting machine tampering. We know there is potential risk there. We haven't seen it happen yet, but one thing that a lot of people are pushing for is for paper ballots to exist. Not that you have to fill out your ballot on paper, but that you fill it out electronically and then it spits out a paper copy that shows what your vote was. You verify that that's the right thing, and then we store all of those. And if there are any questions about what may have happened with the voting machines, we can go back and count all of those. It's much slower, but it means we have an actual physical backup instead of just relying on what's on the computer systems there, which might get messed with. I have not heard a good objection to that, and I do not know why Mitch McConnell does not want that to happen. But that is where things stand now. Yes?
Training might be a problem.
What do you mean?
I mean, training people at these election sites.
Potentially. I mean, there are barriers. Like, it's something that would take a little bit of work to do. And the question is whether that work is worth the benefit or not, and that's a debate worth having potentially. But the other major point of weakness in the election system, as at least the FBI has outlined it, is voter rolls. We already have problems with what's called preemptive purging. This is something that Chris Kobach, who was the Secretary of State, I believe, in Kansas, and then became Trump's voter fraud czar and then kind of got pushed out. He promoted a thing where states would look for anyone who was who they thought might not be a U.S. citizen and would purge them from the voter rolls, and then those people would need to appeal to get their names back on the voter rolls, which takes time and is difficult to do, and they may not know it happened up until the election came. This has been highly controversial, but things like that are the kinds of consequences that can happen if another entity is able to get into voter rolls, like what you were talking about. Like, if they can take people off, they can do that selectively, or they can just cause massive chaos. Russia's objectives in the 2016 election, based on the Mueller report and other investigations by the Senate Intelligence Committee, were twofold. One, to degrade the quality of American democracy, to make people question whether our democracy worked and whether it worked well and whether we can trust it, to sow discord among people in the United States. And that's largely a domestic goal, because most of the argument that Russia often makes to its people is, yeah, we might be corrupt and autocratic, but everybody else has problems too. This is the best you're going to get. Like, you point to the US, look how messed up they are. Back during the Cold War, they pointed to segregation all the time as a way to degrade the moral credibility of the United States and claimed, look, we may not be perfect, but you're not going to find any better. And so degrading the quality of American democracy and putting people at each other's throats here furthers that goal domestically. It also creates more chaos and a potential adversary. The second goal was to enable the election of Donald Trump, not as much because they liked him, but mostly because Putin very much disliked Hillary Clinton because they had clashed several times while she was Secretary of State, and he didn't think he thought that her worldview and her approach to foreign policy would not be advantageous to Russia, and Trump would likely be more advantageous. Probably other things as well, but that's what we know about. Yeah.
The biggest issue with him is the expansion of NATO.
That was certainly one of them, yeah. Again, a whole different discussion, but NATO has been creeping eastward for a long time, and that makes Russia super nervous because NATO was set up to fight the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union's gone, and Russia's like, dude, give us some space. So that's definitely a consideration.
Hillary was a big proponent of that.
Yeah, Hillary is, wow. Again, I'm going to set most of this discussion aside because it's going to sidetrack us a bit more. We only have a little bit of time left. Is it related to this one or separate?
If you were Lithuania, Estonia,
Yeah.
Latvia, Moldova, Poland,
Georgia, yeah.
etc., you really like to be a member of NATO because that ensures that Russia is not going to send troops there.
Yep. We were making overtures to Ukraine at one point, and Russia was really nervous about that because it's their backyard. They annexed part of it a few years ago, that kind of thing. So,
Well, I think the analogy given though is, would we want Venezuela to have Mexico be its
Yep.
ally and be a socialist
Exactly.
country on our
Exactly.
We
Well,
kind of ticked off.
yeah. Well, look at the Cuban Missile Crisis.
During the Cold War,
Same sort of thing.
part of the Soviet war, so
Yep.
we would be ticked off.
Absolutely.
I mean, think of Cuba.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really fault Russia's anxiety here. I think they have every reason to be nervous, and I think there are very legitimate foreign policy arguments about why it is good or bad to expand NATO, and that's a debate that is worth having on both
Get
sides.
nuclear weapons, that's the problem.
Yeah, well, there's that. Either way, for those reasons, the manipulation in the election that happened thus far was not about changing voter rolls or changing votes. It was about changing a lot of other stuff around that and manipulating public opinion via fake information, via propaganda, via artificial hostility, and via releasing stolen documents that were obtained by hacking. That's the bulk of it. So let's go to the last bits here. There are 3 time periods when you can utilize cyber weapons. I'm getting back to the warfare end of things. You've got concurrent strikes, which are, we talked about Nitro Zeus as an example here. It's when you're going in with your military, you can also use cyber stuff to disable the enemy. There's generally consensus that this is kind of an okay thing to do. It's, in a lot of ways, thank you for coming. In a lot of ways, it's sort of the next step upgrade for radar jamming and stuff like that we've used forever. Yeah, during warfare, natural evolution of what we've done. This is largely non-controversial. Second thing you could do is a preemptive strike. Preemption is where someone is about to hit and you hit them first. So someone goes to pull a gun and you shoot them first before they can shoot you, as an example. Israel is masterfully good at this. The way Israel has survived, well, one of the major ways Israel has survived is by having a better intelligence service than anybody else. They know what you are going to eat for breakfast before you've even gotten the menu, and they are willing and able to utilize overwhelming force before anyone has attacked them. Was it the 67 war or the 7 Days War where they hit Egypt's Air Force? I always get those confused. Anyway, back in, I think it was 67, if I got the wrong year, forgive me. But in 67, a bunch of Arab nations got together and they were all like, all right, we don't like Israel. We're really pissed at them. Palestinians are a thing and we don't like them. So you know what? We're gonna get together, we're gonna beat them up. Tomorrow morning, we're gonna do it. Israel found out about it, and about 3 a.m. that morning, the Israeli Air Force took off and destroyed 90% of Egypt's Air Force before it even got off the ground. That's what they do. But on the flip side, if their intelligence had been wrong, they would have attacked a country that had taken no offensive action against them. That's dicey. So preemptive strikes are when conflict is imminent. It is about to happen, and you can be pretty sure. Like someone lines all their tanks up on your border, the U.S. opens all of its silos and starts fueling its missiles. Like that's the time when preemption could happen. So countering an imminent attack. The third and so for cyber attacks, that's where we can mess with capabilities right before a battle might start, mess with enemy communications, that kind of thing. The last category is where actually most of the cyber warfare we've seen has happened, and that's preventative strikes. This is the hardest to justify under international law or in a lot of other frameworks. And this is denying someone the capability to attack. So Stuxnet as an example, right? Iran has nuclear plants going. They're making nuclear fuel. They might enrich that fuel enough to get a bomb. They might then use that fuel to make a bomb. They might then get that bomb put on a missile. They might then use that missile to threaten someone who's our ally, and they might then actually attack that ally with that. That's like 7 steps. So to prevent that whole chain from happening, we're going to hit them way back here with a cyber attack and take out their nuclear refinement capability. Again, you're hitting someone because they may eventually pose a threat, but they haven't done so yet. This, like I said, is hard to justify, and we would not be cool if anybody did it to us, but we're the global hegemon, so we get away with stuff like this. But you deny the capability to attack a long ways in advance. And actually, in terms of legally questionable, the Second Iraq War is another example of this, right? We said Saddam Hussein might be building weapons of mass destruction. We think he is. It's not that he has them and is pointing them at someone. We think he might be creating them. So to prevent him from being able to create them, which he might then put on missiles, which he might then launch at somebody who is not us or is us, we have to hit him back here. And that's an instance where our intelligence was wrong, or we chose to, well, there's a debate over why we did that. But in any case, that's an instance where our argument about prevention was wrong. We were trying to prevent a thing that was not happening. And so we went to war against a country that we had no casus belli, no justification for war. And frankly, it is illegal as an international operation. But man. Most things that we've done, like I said, with cyber ops are in the preventative category. Stuxnet, which we've talked about. The other one are left of launch programs. This is what we've been doing with North Korea, because we've been dancing with them for a while. And frankly, North Korea's cyber capabilities way outstrip pretty much anything else that country can do. They made a choice to focus there, and they've done a pretty good job of it. We've been not too bad in our own responses either. For a long time, North Korea's been developing missile systems. And so if you're going to nuke somebody, you got to make the nuke, and then you got to get it to your target, right? Which means you need both the nuke and the capacity to deliver it. 3 ways to get it there. You can either carry it and drop it there, which generally doesn't work too well because people don't tend to let you do that very often. Or, well, by carry it, I mean like put it on a truck or something. Or you can put it on a plane, fly the plane over, and drop, which only really works against countries that don't have air defense. Otherwise, they shoot down your plane, and that doesn't get you any good. So the way most people will do it is they'll put it on top of a missile, launch the missile, and go boom. But you actually need a fair amount of work to get a missile to be able to deal with a payload that heavy and that awkward, especially if you want to get it a long ways, like intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. That's not just an acronym for what happens when you see the thing coming. That was a joke, ICBM. It's a poo joke, so maybe a little lowbrow. But yeah, I stole it from John Oliver, so you blame him. But they're incredibly difficult feats of engineering to do. Like in some ways, the technology that got us to the moon is easier to do than the technology to get an ICBM where you want it to go. You got to get it out of the atmosphere, flies through space, it re-enters and doesn't break up, and then it hits a target that's very small, half a planet away. So a lot of work goes into that. North Korea has been working on building up its ICBMs. It's had nukes for a while now. And so the US is a little concerned about that, because as of now, they can hit the US, but for a while, they could hit some nearby neighbors. They could certainly hit South Korea, they could hit Japan, and that's a concern, but if they can't hit the US mainland, we're not quite as worried. They were developing their missiles for quite a while. They were doing all right with it, and then for about a year, their success rate on missile launches dropped to like 10%. 85% of their launches failed, either at launch or right afterwards, and nobody knew why. We're just sitting over here. Oh, that's a pity. That totally sucks. Oh, maybe you should double check your engines next time. No, we don't know anything about it. Nothing at all. Yeah, cyber war. Those are what are referred to as left of launch programs. Instead of like trying to shoot down a missile, we don't know specifically what malware it was, we got something into part of the rocket system and the computers that ran it, and we caused the missiles to either blow up as they tried to take off or shortly afterwards. It took North Korea a year to try to deal with that. They eventually ended up having to swap out the whole engine system for another old Soviet one. Then they were back on course, but it's again a preventative strike. Right? They might have finished developing this missile and hit us. This one comes closer to the preemptive one, but it's still, I think, firmly in this category because they're not actually threatening us yet with something that has the capacity to hit us. But that's another example of cyber warfare deployed to prevent a conflict, or at least to prevent an enemy's capacity. Last chunk. I want to run through some pros and cons of deploying cyber warfare, and then y'all we'll discuss with whatever time we have left, or you can ponder in your own minds. So benefits to utilizing offensive cyber operations. First is defense versus offense. The US is stupidly vulnerable. We've covered this, but there are a couple reasons for this. One, we have large networks, we have tons of stuff connected to everything, and almost all of those can be entry points to get in and attack us. The more networks you have spread out, the more vulnerable you are. Second, and this is a huge one, our key infrastructure is under private control. Right? If someone wants to hit our power plants like we covered earlier, the US government is not running defense on those power plants, National Grid is. Which means that we can only deploy our state power in offense, not in defense, at least against all of those kinds of targets. Which means that they are significantly more vulnerable. If you're China or you're Russia, the government comes in and says, this is the software you're installing on your computer, and you do it. The US, we don't have the capacity to make companies do that, which makes us more vulnerable. So the argument then is, since we can't do defense very well, or we're uniquely vulnerable, we should focus on preventative strikes as our form of defense. We can't stop the attack once it gets here, so we should find out where it's coming from or where people are developing it, hit them first and shut them down, and use that as a deterrent. The great example here is during the 2018 midterms, the Internet Research Agency, the Russian troll farm where a lot of the 2016 chaos came out of, the US hit them with a cyber attack the day of the midterms and shut them down for 2 days straight. Pretty effective. We don't know if they were going to do anything during the midterms or not. In all likelihood, they probably were. But they certainly weren't able to after we hit them. So this is an argument for deploying offensive cyber operations. If we can't defend, attack first. Second category in terms of benefits are how cyber weapons work out against non-state actors. So nowadays, there's very little state versus state war, right? Unlike back in the day, it's not two countries against one another. It's either two countries fighting proxy battles against one another, which is a lot of what the Cold War was, or it's non-state groups like terrorist groups and stuff like that that are coming at a government. So here, I mentioned Operation Glowing Symphony at the very beginning. This was what we used against ISIS. And this is where we basically messed up all of their computers and emails and websites and made life really difficult for them. It had a huge psychological toll on a lot of those people. It also made, like, a lot of what ISIS trades on, or at least had traded on, was the idea of inevitability or invincibility. So, like, as long as they were being successful, it was a lot easier for them to recruit people. And they're honestly a very media-savvy organization. They're better at that than pretty much any terrorist group we have ever encountered by an order of magnitude. So being able to mess with that capability did a lot to degrade their ability to recruit and degrade their ability to coordinate an attack. One of the other benefits here is that it's oftentimes better to target groups like this with a cyber attack than with a kinetic attack. If you drop a bomb on what you think is an ISIS or Al-Qaeda training camp, you almost always have collateral damage and civilian casualties. But with a cyber attack, not only do they not kill people very often, so then you can avoid that kind of thing, like physical damage instances is the only time where that might be a risk, and even then it's pretty low. But not only are you not likely killing people, but it also means you can much more precisely target the specific computers that are doing the things that are problems, that are attached to the people in question. And that breeds less resentment. It means there are fewer people who now want to join up to attack you because you just killed their family that happened to be living next door to a training camp. Third thing is that cyber weapons can function as a substitute for war, or they can head off the need for a war. Stuxnet, in all likelihood, prevented a war in the Middle East. The US and especially Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the leader, well, now it's up in the air, but had been the leader of Israel for a while, very militaristic is probably a fair word. I don't think he's met a war he doesn't like. And so Netanyahu's approach to Iran working on developing nuclear weapons back under George W. Bush and under Obama was find their facilities, blow them up. It's actually what Israel has done in the past. When Iraq, way back in the 80s and 90s, when Iraq was starting to develop nuclear weapons, or at least working on that, Israel found the plants, they blew them up. When Libya was working on a nuclear weapons program, when Syria looked into similar stuff, Israel finds the weapons plant, it blows it up. It doesn't care whether there's a war or not. It believes generally the best solution is to find and destroy the capability. So Netanyahu is pushing really hard for the US and or Israel to go in and hit Iran. The way that things were working, most of the nuclear plants that were available and that were spinning centrifuges and enriching uranium, a lot of them were things that Israel had the capacity to hit. There were a few of them that were buried deep enough underground that Israel couldn't hit those effectively. The US had the weaponry to do it, but Israel didn't. And the longer we waited to strike, the less they needed the outside facilities, the more they could just use the ones that were buried. So from Israel's perspective, the window to hit them is closing. So if you don't hit soon, we'll lose the chance to. And for Israel, at least for Netanyahu, Iran having a nuclear weapon is utterly unacceptable. So what happened, and actually it got deployed under Bush, but Obama really pushed Israel to focus on it. We disabled a lot of their nuclear capability via Stuxnet, and that headed off the need, or at least the desire, for Israel and the US to attack directly. Realistically, it also bought time for diplomacy. The Iran nuclear deal, while some people have criticisms of it, did a heck of a lot and was honestly probably the best solution we had to stopping an Iranian nuclear weapon. Until Trump decided to break the deal, it was working pretty well. And cyber warfare helped to set that up. Let's flip to the other side. Major costs of cyber warfare, because we hear a lot about the benefits. This side is also super important. The first is the risk of creation. Creating cyber weapons is a uniquely fraught activity, because remember, the way you do it is you find a gap in a system that people are using, your people included, and then you don't fix it, right? You leave that deliberately open, and you just hope nobody else finds it until you decide to exploit it. And there are some people out there who are as smart as we are, in fact a lot of them, and that happens. So there's a big risk there, and this is also part of what makes the US more vulnerable, right? The more cyber weapons we develop, the more gaps we choose to leave, the more places hackers can find to potentially hit us. So the nature of cyber offense and wanting to engage in it necessarily means you must weaken your cyber defense. So that becomes a solid argument potentially to not engage in offense as much, to do a very limited amount of it or none. Second, there is a big risk that the weapons you develop get stolen. Remember NotPetya and Wannacry? Both of those were from an NSA weapon. The NSA developed it, it got stolen, then the Russians and the North Koreans both altered it a little bit and hit us with it. It's a thing. And there's that sort of thing happens with alarming frequency. The other thing, so in 2017 is when that happened. A group called the Shadow Brokers are the ones who stole it and then sold them on the dark web to people. Chinese government likely also stole some of our stuff in 2016. We're not exactly sure what, but we know they got away with some stuff. So that's going to be coming around later, and then we talked about these two attacks, both being from stolen cyber weapons. In terms of cost, the fact that most cyber attacks are at this short of war threshold has some really big concerns. The big one is that where that always invites escalation, right? If I can mess up your internet research agency, then you can mess up Microsoft computing. And if you can mess with Microsoft, maybe I can take your whole financial system offline. If I take your financial system offline, maybe you take my power grid offline, and things keep escalating. And we don't know exactly where that threshold is when all of a sudden something happens that we can't ignore and we have to treat as an act of war. And since we don't know where that is and they don't know where that is, somebody is inevitably going to cross it. Which means that cyber warfare has a very high likelihood of creating miscalculation, where somebody guesses wrong about how far they can push before someone actually attacks them and starts a war. There's, I think, a fairly strong argument that cyber warfare eventually is going to pull us into a conventional war. Like right now, we are basically in a permanent state of low-grade cyber warfare between China, Iran, and Russia, and North Korea. The next thing that's really important here is the idea of long-term norms. Right now, the last 20 years are really the only time that cyber weapons have existed. We're still trying to figure out what the rules are with them. We've had game-changing technologies before. Nuclear weapons, to say nothing, are certainly one, but even biological and chemical weapons, which were used in some ways, way back. But First World War is where chemical weapons really came into their own as a thing. They've vastly changed the nature of warfare, but we were still able to come together and create a treaty to, by and large, ban their use. They still occasionally get used, but they're certainly not ubiquitous, and they're not going off all the time. So what we do right now sets a lot of the standard for what is seen as acceptable. If the US did it, then most other countries feel they can get away with doing it as well. And that sets a lot of dangerous precedents. So if we want to have any hope of developing some kind of cyber weapon regime or some kind of arms control for cyber weapons, now is the time when it's going to need to happen, and the actions we take now are going to shape what people are willing to say is or is not acceptable. Because if we punt, it's the sort of I'm going to beat you up, and now I'm going to sign an agreement that nobody can beat anybody up anymore. Works great for me. You have no incentive to sign that agreement because you want to get back at me, and now I'm cutting off your ability to do that. So the more we use it now, the less likely people are to say, we'll give it up, because we're already getting the benefit. So Last thing, like I mentioned, right now what's going on is a lot of low-grade cyber warfare that risks not only creating larger scale warfare, but it also risks causing a lot of inefficiencies and disruption across the board, right? Every time someone's financial system gets messed up, every time a national health service gets attacked, that degrades the quality of life of people like across the planet. And the more this escalates, the more of those disruptions we're going to have. And that means eventually a lot of the things that technology has enabled us to do better may end up being worse than they might have been otherwise. And that kind of sets humanity as a whole back. It's a more broad scale concern, and it's a little further off in the future, but I do think it's something worth thinking about. And again, our actions help to move whether or not we go in that direction. The questions I will leave you with, because we don't have enough time, unfortunately, to really talk about them, are these two. First, what should the rules of cyber warfare be? Should there be rules, and if so, what is and is not off limits? And second, if there aren't any international rules, assume we can't set up something like that, at least we aren't able to set it up for a while, what should the US do in that case? So like right now, should the US be engaged in offensive cyber operations or not? And there have been both costs and benefits. We have, it looks like, 6 minutes. Yeah?
You've actually gotten till 3. You've just been here before, so I gave you a little less.
Fair, I talk forever. So, thoughts, what do you think? Should we do it or not?
Well, in the case of the second question,
Yeah.
you could make the argument that Stuxnet, which you made a few minutes ago,
Yeah.
was preferable to conducting an aerial bombardment
Yeah.
campaign, which would have led to a full-blown war.
Agreed.
So that's a point in its favor in certain extreme circumstances. But to put it out as a broad principle is
Yeah.
dicey.
Yeah. And that's the catch. Like most of these arguments have weight to them. It's how they compare to each other, right? The benefits of preventing war there versus the costs of potentially creating a war with miscalculation and escalation. I don't know. What do y'all think? If we get to vote and set policy, and we do get to vote, and that sometimes translates into policy, one would hope, what should it be?
And as far as the first question,
Yeah.
if some subsequent administration, some future administration were to try to formulate international rules of cyber warfare, I suspect that countries that don't have parity with the United States in terms of conventional military power would not want to go along with that.
Yeah.
Because to them, cyber warfare is it's a type of asymmetric warfare that gives them an advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that may be worth thinking about there, so the comprehensive, not the Test Ban Treaty, but the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. It's the treaty that most of the world has signed that says nations that have nukes won't give them to countries that don't have nukes won't develop them. But the other thing that it has is countries with nuclear technology will help enable other countries to have peaceful nuclear power programs. That's kind of the exchange. You give up the ability to get new nuclear weapons, but the treaty says those people are obligated to help you out if you want to build a nuclear power plant. That's kind of the trade-off. So it may be that in order to get countries like that to join on, we'd have to offer some kind of benefit if they're going to give up that potential edge. And maybe that is tech assistance, maybe that is resources, maybe that's money, I don't know. But yeah, that's a good thought. Yeah, go for it.
What does the average person can do to get this?
A lot of that has to do with who you vote for and what questions you ask of your candidates.
But we don't have any, we have so little say in kind of what you're talking about and who gets elected to these national leadership. I mean, I guess we got more say in Congress
And that's
part of it.
Well, part of it is most of this stuff is done via the executive. So the presidency is the thing that makes most of these determinations, barring Congress actually being able to pass a law and do a thing, which isn't really likely these days. But even then, like the NSA is an executive agency. Cyber Command is part of the military under the command of the president. The FBI, to the extent they use this kind of stuff, an executive agency. So this is something to think about when it comes to potential presidential candidates or vice presidential candidates. Yeah.
My other thought is the wealth disparity. I think that is probably the biggest issue in the world, I think.
One of two, yeah.
Because, the wealth, from the big, the most wealthiest to the poorest, it's huge. And not only that, it's these poor people, you can have 1 billion poor people, and they have less power than maybe 1 or 2 of these wealthier people.
Yeah. And there, the solution has to do, in my opinion, again, this is me as an individual, not like trying to dispense factual info. I think the solution there has to do with election financing reform. Public financing of campaigns would solve 95% of those problems. The public financing system is one where you prohibit any private donations to political campaigns of any kind. The government provides candidates with a certain amount of money once they reach a particular threshold. And figuring some of the details out takes work, but once a candidate reaches a certain threshold, the government says, here's the money that you get to do ads and campaigning. That's all you get. Can't spend anything else, can't request donations from anybody else, can't take donations from anybody else. That's it. You also have to pair that with restrictions on external groups doing electioneering, and that means you probably need a constitutional amendment because the Supreme Court has decided, actually in Citizens United, they reaffirmed the idea that money is speech, which is, I can see their logic, and that's a longer discussion, but I think that's, if you change that, you change a lot of other things.
The other part is the wealth. You know, so Jeff Bezos and, you know, like Bill Gates, you know, they are so wealthy that they can, you know, they don't pay their fair share of taxes because the laws are so that the taxes, their wealth is not taxed.
Yeah, the 2017 tax bill actually, interestingly enough, there was an article, I think it was in the Washington Post yesterday or the day before, it said the wealthiest 400 families in the United States now have an effective tax rate that is lower than the middle classes. And it's because, a lot of that is because most rich people get money by having money, and that they make capital gains, they buy stock or they purchase part of a company, and then when that does better, they make money off of that. Whereas most people further down on the scale make money via employment and wages. We do a job, we get a paycheck, and what we tax paychecks and income at a much higher rate than we tax capital gains. Capital gains is at 15%, which is, in my opinion, kind of laughable. But we've gotten a bit off topic. Any other things on this one? Otherwise, I think we're probably going to wrap for today. Yeah?
You did mention there was a book.
Yes! Thank you. It is, right there. Actually, I'll put this whole thing up here. So, top one is the book that I'd recommend, The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, Fear in the Cyber Age. David Sanger does an excellent job. He's a reporter. He's been working on cyber warfare forever. Yep.
Is there an easy way for you to share this PowerPoint?
Yes, I've actually given it to the gentleman who is videotaping all of this, and it will be up on the videotape. Where does the video show up?
It's on cable, and you can get it on the internet.
Cool.
Since it's telemedia.
Cool.
Everything we record, and it'll be a copy here at the library.
And there you go.
So you can access all that information that way.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. So yeah, just to note what these are, this is the book, this is the one I'd most recommend out of the list. The second one, this is just a short article, but it's an article by NPR. They're citing a much denser report by the Government Accountability Office. This is basically the part of the government that checks up on the government itself and sees how it's doing. They looked at the Pentagon and how secure the Pentagon was. It's not at all. And so this is the report saying that. So NPR summarizes it pretty well if you want to get an idea. This is a more technical academic article. I'm sorry, no, that's the bottom one. This is from the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Analysis. They're a think tank. They're a group that looks at US foreign policy and domestic policy. And this one's a couple years old. I think it was 2012, so it doesn't have the most recent stuff, but it does an excellent job explaining the background of how a lot of different developments came about, what the calculus was for why, and what they've been able to do. And then this last one is an academic article, an academic journal article in Strategic Studies Quarterly. I expect the library has some databases that will have access to that, but if not, they can probably find you a place that does.
We also have access to the Sanger book.
Oh, sweet.
Our copy's checked out right now. So definitely hold it for that.
Yep. The audiobook of the Sanger one is actually also quite good. I listened to it on commutes, and it was great. And it's the unabridged version, so it's the whole thing. But this guy, Max Smeets, if you do any research into this topic, you will hear about him a fair amount. He's one of the people who's pretty high profile in this, knows his stuff, does a lot of work with NATO. But he particularly looks at offensive cyber weapons and the benefits or costs of those, some of which we've outlined, but he goes in a lot more detail there. So if you want a really in-depth read on this, he's the one you'll want to look at. So there you are. Thank you all very much. I hope it was accessible and informative.